Welcome back to another episode of Her Expat Life. We are the YouTube channel that is dedicated to bringing female entrepreneurs, digital nomads, and expats all the information they need to advance their global lifestyle. If you're curious about our offering, please visit our website, herexpatlife.com, and see all the services that we can offer and that we have available to our members. Today, we have a very, very exciting guest that I'm very excited to speak to. Her name is Sally Clarke, and she is an expert in the field of burnout, which is a topic that I know affects a lot of our viewers. And today we're going to look at the angle specifically on how burnout affects digital nomads and those who are maybe not living the conventional, traditional office lifestyle. I'm going to intro Sally. I'm going to give you a bit of a brief background on her. So Sally Clarke is an author, speaker, researcher, well-being and burnout expert, and human leader. Her mission is to embed well-being in how we work so the word burnout becomes redundant. She researches, writes, and raises her voice on well-being and burnout around the globe. She speaks and facilitates workshops on how we can prevent burnout at individual, organizational, and cultural levels. She helps people make positive, impactful change through coaching and speaking, and she helps clients reach a goal, evolve after burnout, or create authenticity, purpose, and fulfillment. Her 2 books, Protect Your Spark, How to Prevent Burnout and Live Authentically, and Relight Your Spark, How to Heal and Evolve After Burnout, are available on Amazon. Sally, thank you for joining us today.
It's such a delight to be with you, Alexia. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for making the time. I know that you're really busy, so we really do appreciate you being here. Okay, Sally, let's dive straight into it. Can you please introduce yourself in a little bit more detail than I have? Tell us a bit about your journey. Who are you and how did you get to this point in your life?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So I was born and grew up in countryside South Australia. So I lived on a farm for the first 16 years of my life. I was an exchange student in the Netherlands when I was 16, and that was a really impactful year in my life, living overseas at the time without internet, very far from home. It was really, really transformative. I went back to Australia and studied Bachelor of Arts and law. And then when I graduated, I sort of felt like I'm not ready to grow up yet. So I traveled in Europe for half a year with a friend, ended up in Amsterdam and London, back in Amsterdam, working as a finance lawyer. So I did sort of finally, sort of grow up and become a lawyer. But within a couple of years, I was really struggling. I was working at one of the top firms, often working 70 to 80-hour weeks. And one winter Friday night, I was flying to a town in France called Nantes, which is where my brother was doing a postdoc. And when I arrived at the airport, when I walked into the arrivals hall and laid eyes on my brother, I collapsed to the ground and I started crying and I couldn't stop. And that was the moment when I realized I was in burnout, and I had been for some time. I was very lucky. I was privileged to be in a position to be able to quit my job and leave the law and take some time to heal from burnout. I did a yoga teacher training and ended up spending a lot of time. I actually moved to Morocco for about 2.5 years, where I led yoga retreats, meditation retreats, and taught at surf camps and hotels in the south of Morocco. I thought I was going to learn to surf in that time. I still surf, but really, really badly. And ended up moving to Portugal for a while, worked remotely as a copywriter and translator in Portugal, continued doing yoga and meditation. And at a certain point, I just got really curious about what I'd been through. I think I'd held some shame around being through burnout that had kind of caused me to ignore it and soldier on forward. I took some time over a few years to kind of start to research burnout. And I really brought that lawyer lens to, what causes burnout and how we can heal and evolve after burnout. That led to my 2 books and to the work I do today. I've since lived in California. I've been back in Australia for a while. My brother lives in Brazil now, so I certainly understand and really resonate with the experience of being an expat and also working remotely and being that sort of having that nomadic lifestyle. And I'm really grateful because now the work I do today feels like a really kind of a tapestry of my own experience, what I've been through, the skills that I have, and my sort of deep passion for helping others to find their way out of burnout or even hopefully prevent going through it altogether.
That's amazing. The more I interview people, the more I realize everybody's life journey somehow leads them to their purpose if they look just a little bit deeper into things. So yeah, I think you really have a lens and perspective to talk about this topic because you lived through it. And like you said, you've actually and still are an expat. Yeah, I'm very curious to deep dive into this with you. Okay, Sally, my next question is, you're an author of 2 books that are available on Amazon at the moment. Please give us an overview of the books and what brought you to write them.
Another great question. So really when I started writing, I wanted to write the kind of Bible on burnout. I wanted to go into sort of, everything you need to know about burnout. But I realized there's different lenses that we can look at burnout through. One is a very academic lens to understand what at a physiological level the experience of burnout is. Another is through the organizational level, sort of understanding what are the causes that lead to the chronic stress that causes burnout. But my books are really for individuals and they're kind of for myself, if I'm honest. The first is really the message I would have liked to have given myself 2 or 3 years before I burnt out around protecting my spark, taking action to know myself and love myself more deeply to help me protect that spark rather than slowly, gradually sinking into this quite damaging burnout. And the other, Relight Your Spark, is the book that would have been helpful for me to have had in probably the year and a half after I acknowledged that I'd been through a burnout, as a kind of a guide to understand first and foremost that burnout is never the individual's fault. When I was researching and I came to that conclusion, it was a shock to me because I realized I was holding on to some personal shame that it must have been some weakness or failure on my part that had led to that happening, when in fact it's the opposite. Burnout is actually our body's natural, intelligent response when we are under prolonged chronic stress. So that's kind of what led me to write the books in that way, to make them quite personal and hopefully a little bit of a guide through the challenging phases we experience in life.
How do you define burnout and what are its key indicators, especially in the context of remote work?
So the World Health Organization actually defined burnout in 2019. And as a researcher, I adhere to that definition. And that is that burnout is a syndrome that results from chronic workplace stress. And it has 3 dimensions. So we use 3 dimensions to measure whether someone is in burnout. Those are exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy, which basically just means you can't do as much as you used to be able to do or at as high a level of quality as you could. I think when we're starting to think about what are the signals of burnout, it's really about thinking about the physical, emotional, and even mental signals that we start to receive that things just aren't going as well as they used to. Because burnout is a result of chronic stress, chronic stress occurs when we kind of have a stress response and we get stuck in it. We're in this heightened state of alert all the time, and that has a really debilitating impact on our physiology. So we might start to notice that we're getting sick more often. Maybe we're getting headaches that won't go away as easily. At first, early in burnout, we kind of feel wired or high because there's this, when we're under this stress, we have respond to the stressor, and it's kind of fun, honestly, kind of cool vibe of, I can stay up all night after night, get what I need to done. And that very easily sort of then plays into our ego and our sense of identity as well, that we can really work hard, push ourselves and get through it okay. Eventually, it simply wears us down. Particularly for me, I find the cynicism dimension quite interesting because that's when we start to get a bit withdrawn. We start to maybe pull back very subtly at first, but from friendships, from relationships, even from our work, maybe a little bit less caring about what happens in the world. I remember noticing that I was at the supermarket one day and the person at the checkout was very nice to me, and I couldn't muster the energy to be nice back to them. And that, looking back, was it's small, but it was absolutely a signal that I wasn't who I naturally am, which is a friendly person who seeks interaction. So these signals can be quite subtle. One thing that makes it challenging is that once we're in a state of chronic stress, our perspective is very narrowed, and it can be very difficult to make healthy decisions for ourselves in that place. So this is why it's really helpful to be alert as early as possible to those signals from our body, our emotions, our mind, that something is not right and we need to address it.
In your view, what constitutes optimal well-being for individuals working remotely in particular, and how does it differ from the traditional workplace setting?
It's an interesting question because I think there are so many modalities of working remotely. For some of us, that means actually having a salaried job where we're still working, let's say, 40 hours a week for a company, and we still ostensibly are part of an organization. We're just not at the organization. For others, it'll mean freelancing. And I think these 2 different kinds, and that's kind of the ends of the spectrum, and there can be all kinds of permutations of this, and even different ones completely. I think to make a big generalization, it's really about ensuring that we're making our personal health our first priority. So physical, mental, and emotional well-being really being central to your life. It's so easy for work, in whatever form it manifests, to take first priority, and for us to skip that afternoon walk or eat lunch at the desk, all kinds of ways that we think we're kind of hacking the system, but we're actually doing ourselves in the long term a disservice. So it's difficult to talk sort of in generalizations, but I think that really prioritizing our well-being, and particularly when we're working remotely, to stay connected to other human beings. We are a social species. It is a basic psychological need for us to feel connected to others. And I think, speaking also from my own experience, when we're in a remote environment, it can be quite easy to go through days, if not weeks, without really feeling a genuine connection to other people. And I'm speaking for some people that you might be completely by yourself, or you might still have sort of social interactions around you. You might be with a partner, with a family, whatever form your life takes, really actively seeking out those connections, even if it's just exchanging memes with one friend, and with another it's having a weekly call, but really fundamentally feeling connected, because when we don't, we can start to withdraw, and we can start to when we start to struggle, it becomes that much harder to actually reach out. It can be a very isolating experience if we don't actively, really nourish those social connections.
What are the key trends you've observed in remote work, or working from home, or working, office? Well, I think now the trend has become a lot of people are working from home. So also remote work, not necessarily from another country, but just maybe not in the office.
Yeah.
But in remote work and its impact on burnout and well-being over the past few years. So we do know that the pandemic changed a lot of things. In particular, what trends have you seen come out of this?
Personally fascinated by, because I do work remotely, and it is really interesting to think about this in the context of burnout and what causes burnout. I co-author a report every year. It's a study. We conduct a survey, and then we write this kind of beautiful report. Actually, the study is open at the moment, speaking in October, and the report will be launched in February 2024. Our findings last year were, in fact, that, and I was quite surprised by this, but people who were working primarily remotely were most likely to have the higher rate of burnout. People who are working hybrid, so 2 to 3 days, let's say on a full-time basis, 2 to 3 days in the office, 2 to 3 days at home, least likely to be in burnout. And people in the office were somewhere in the middle, so 100% sort of in person. And I was kind of annoyed by this result, if I'm honest, because I really enjoy working remotely. And so I was kind of hoping that there'd be some magic link between remote work and drastically reduced rates of burnout. But unfortunately, it really does make sense to me when I think about it. While I'm certainly not an advocate of everyone being in the office, I think it kind of speaks again to those social connections that we can miss when we're in remote work, and that it does take that extra effort to disconnect. The laptop is always at the dining table, and we walk past it all the time, and it's maybe even forming part of how we disconnect later on Netflix. It's that sort of the way that work permeates our lives, particularly in a remote setting, that can be damaging.
I know I often hear people say that it's a lot harder to be sick these days because, instead of just being able, pre-pandemic, we would say, okay, I'm not feeling well, I'm not coming into the office today, or I'm not going to work today. And that was acceptable. But now it's kind of this idea of, but you can work from home. So it's almost this intermeshing of your work life and your home life, and not having a clear boundary or definition or separation of the two, that I think a lot of people are struggling with. This idea of, okay, I work from home, but then how do I disconnect when I'm done? Or how do I separate my bedroom being my office, or my dining room table being where I spend time with my family, and where my boss is contacting me via Slack? So yeah, it's interesting if you can talk about that, like how can people disconnect those two worlds meeting now in their homes?
I just want to highlight first, these are great points, and it is really hard because the way the technology has evolved, and then with this kind of push through the pandemic to a lot of sort of increased remote work. And a lot of the boundaries that used to naturally exist in a pre-internet environment have simply dissolved. And, I think we put a lot of, and I'm speaking sort of for this moment in the organizational context, I think too much pressure is put on the individual to create boundaries, to be inherently resilient, and to, irrespective of how they're being treated, to somehow be able to push back and simply log off at 5 p.m. And I think it's what we need to see in an organizational context is much more active redesign of how we work by senior leaders that then moves through the organization to ensure that norms and disconnection are a part of how the company operates. And in my work with human leaders, we work with companies around the world, some of them global, who have different time zones, different parameters. Sometimes there's peaks and there's troughs of activity. There's always a way to make work more human and to make it sustainable for the people involved. And for those of us who are working, sort of remotely for an organization, I'd say taking charge of your own agenda to that extent. So planning in your calendar when you want to go for a walk, and sticking with those things, really sticking with the agreements, the dates that you make with yourself. And for anyone freelancing remotely, and I have a lot of friends in this position, it really is, I think, this is going to sound a bit hippie, but it really starts from a place of self-love, that you really need to prioritize your own health and your well-being for the sustainability of your career, particularly as a freelancer, when you often can't really, a year and a half off to recover from burnout just isn't feasible. That kind of preemptive, fierce self-compassion to prioritize yourself and your well-being is going to be essential in the long term.
Sally, as we're talking, I'm trying to understand how someone who is maybe fearful that they could be experiencing burnout, how do they differentiate having a bad day, a bad week, a bad month from, oh no, I'm heading towards burnout? What are the indicators? How can we get a clear idea of whether it's just maybe a period of difficulty that we're experiencing at work, or if this is heading towards disaster?
Yeah, I think it's one of the measures is how, when you're in a period of rest, so say it's the weekend, can you actually, do you feel energized, and can you let go of work and do other things and enjoy them? It's a very arbitrary test. But for a lot of people, when you're in burnout, some people can barely get out of bed on the weekend. Others might be, doing things, but are really just going through the motions, living through glass and just thinking about work. There's so many different ways that it can show up. But certainly, burnout isn't a bad day or a bad week, in the context of a generally healthy sort of work life. And we all, I think there are very few jobs these days that really are sort of very similar in terms of stress level from day to day to day. So it's about, I think, zooming out a little bit and looking over months. Is my health declining? Have I noticed some of these symptoms that I mentioned earlier? And does this feel like just the way things are at this point? So again, it's difficult to know in ourselves, but I think for many of us, and to anyone watching who's sort of thinking, oh, that kind of sounds a little bit familiar, any action you take now, even if you err on the side of caution in preventing burnout, you're doing yourself a service.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned, and we were kind of talking about how the organization needs to do more, and I really like this theme because I feel like we've been told, or we've been taught subconsciously, that burnout is our responsibility to manage. But realistically speaking, if you have a boss who's not understanding where you're coming from, it's going to be very difficult to push back. So on that note, how can organizations promote well-being and mental health support specifically for remote employees?
This is one of the things that I've thought a lot about since we had those findings last year in our study around remote work, having this correlation with higher rates of burnout. And it's a complex topic, and it really is sort of something that we almost have to have our conversations with different leaders look kind of different from one organization to the next. At a baseline, it's really about, I think has been a fundamental underestimation of the amount of connection and time investment that managers need to make in connecting with their team members. And I'm not saying it needs to become a full-time thing. And I know most managers already have too many things on their plate, but these are little strategic things that we can build in and almost habit stack in terms of one-on-ones with individuals, creating space for questions. So often, particularly younger employees, especially if you're new to an organization and you're working remotely, it can feel quite intimidating to ask questions. You might feel like, sure, everyone else knows this, I just don't want to seem dumb. But really creating that kind of forum where there is a safe space to ask questions. Buddy, systems, mentoring can help. But I think it's really that active connecting with people. One thing that tends to work, and this is a very simple thing, but I've seen it at a few companies now where weekly meetings are opened. I start with around 10 minutes of just socializing, just what's happened on the weekend, how's your dog, connecting in those kind of ways. And that sounds very arbitrary. And I think sometimes when we implement these things, people are like, oh, let's just talk about work. I don't want to waste my time. But it's those kind of connections that help us know each other more deeply as human beings. And that's a really important part of work for most of us. We really need to feel engaged, and having that connection with the humans with whom we work is important to that. I think also, and this is almost like a meta thing, but for leaders to really build a sense of trust and respect with their employees so that they are safe when they need to say, hey, I've got too much going on, or something's happened in my personal life and I don't have as much capacity this week. Opening space for honest conversations is really key. And that's something that takes time to build up. That's not a switch that we can flick.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Leading on to that point, what specific leadership qualities are crucial for managing remote teams and fostering a healthy environment? What do leaders need to focus more on, if we can dive a little bit more into that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of active listening and asking the right questions, because by that I mean a really active listening in that way where having the situation where you're actively listening and the person is telling you their honest truth hinges on having that sense of trust and respect and psychological safety, which is the ability to take interpersonal risk without fear of a negative consequence. So building this kind of space of, we can be transparent here, you can say what's going on. This also leads to higher rates of innovation and creativity. It tends to lead to higher rates of loyalty, lower turnover, people leaving the organization too. So it really has a lot of benefits. But creating that space for people to be open and honest, sometimes it also helps for leaders to lead with a bit of transparency around what they're going through, some vulnerability. And too often I think we associate vulnerability with just wild oversharing. It's not that, but it's about that being truthful and authentic in ourselves so that people feel that they can bring forth problems. They can also bring forth solutions, and I think we too often assume if we're not hearing anything from someone that things are okay. No news is good news. And I really think we need to drop that assumption and actively check in with people. And, I say sometimes, it's not, the manager is not responsible for a person's well-being, but they're responsible for their impact on it. And it's amazing what managers can do when they do reach out and build these bonds and really transform what people's experience of work is like. It can be incredibly impactful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The next question is something that I am fascinated by and equally terrified of, and that is where technology is going and how it's going to be, how it's going to be impacting the workplace. For example, I heard recently about a woman who had lost her job. She was fired. And one of the key points that management had brought up in making the decision that they no longer wanted her to work there is that they were monitoring her mouse movements remotely. And basically, she wasn't on her computer enough. Her mouse wasn't moving enough for them to, basically, they were saying she wasn't working hard enough, even though her outputs had been reached, her KPIs had been reached. So there seems to be this idea of, even though you're working remotely, you're working from home, your boss is not there looking over your shoulder. They are finding innovative ways to measure productivity. But is that really measuring productivity? And also, this type of technology, what's the impact going to have on us in terms of burnout?
I'm so gobsmacked when I hear these kinds of stories, Alexia, because it really appalls me that any leader in any organization today can consider that a way to create a healthy and productive workplace. We have so much data at this point to show that when people are healthy and when they're trusted, quality of work, productivity levels, engagement, innovation levels, all of these things flourish. And I don't think it takes a genius to understand that when we're being remotely tracked in terms of our mouse movements, that creates a really horrific, I think, in sort of relationship in terms of any trust or respect being destroyed, and really reduces humans to numbers and metrics. And it's certainly a strong part of things that part of the things that we advise organizations. Luckily, I haven't actually had to, work with an organization where I've had to have them remove that kind of technology.
Yeah.
It's probably, I can see how for some it might seem like a tempting fix, because it's like, well, then we have a metric, we've got this data. And for a lot of people, I think there's this misconception that having a more human-centered approach takes more time and effort, and we can just treat people like machines and it's going to be more efficient. And the irony is, and there is so much research to back this, but that when we treat humans as humans, again, innovation, quality of work, productivity, loyalty, all of these things really flourish. So I think we're no doubt that technology is to some extent here to stay. I think what we're going to see in the future is, as a real differentiating factor in where people choose to work, is going to be how they treat their people. And these stories, this is one of the advantages of the internet, these stories get out and are reported. And I think that's a really helpful thing in this context. There's so many conversations going on right now around, the potential good and bad, I guess, of AI and other sort of evolving technologies. I think there are ways that technology can be used very positively in terms of streamlining work and making things easier. I think people will also sort of vote with their feet to some extent if they realize that they're being monitored in that way. It's dehumanizing, and it's simply not okay.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I don't understand how anyone would think that monitoring their staff in that way would motivate their staff to do better work. It just feels to me.
So archaic to me, but it really is archaic, and it's old thinking. And this is something that I love in my work with younger generations as well, as I really see a shift in thinking around that this is something that I'm really curious to see how things pan out. But the optimistic part of me hopes in 20 years, this is just not even a thing anymore.
Are there specific tools or technologies that can aid in improving mental health and well-being for remote employees?
I mean, there's certainly tools and technologies that we can use. And if we're thinking about, apps through which we can do yoga classes, do meditations online. I've certainly, with my very nomadic lifestyle, I don't get to go to a lot of in-person yoga classes. And of course, for a couple of years, we couldn't. So having that sort of online place, and I've taught yoga, I do a lot of yoga myself, but actually having the class system online, I've found remarkably helpful in my own practice and sense of connectedness. I also, I listen to Tara Brach's meditation on her podcast, for example. So there's certainly different ways that we can use those kind of technologies, and there is a lot of technology available. And perhaps I am going to sound a bit old school in my answer here, but I also think sometimes we rush towards technology as a solution when perhaps a walk in the park without our phone will actually physiologically calm our nervous system much more quickly. Perhaps actually having a chat with a friend and speaking to them on a phone call rather than reading a bunch of posts about well-being will actually have a quicker effect. I think one of the keys to burnout recovery is really reconnecting with our physical body and the signals that it's showing us, and really understanding how our nervous system gets activated when we're in stress, and how we really need to actively then engage the other part of our nervous system to relax and to really come back to a state of equilibrium. And so I think, a lot of those practices really are offline things. It can be breathing exercises, it can be forms of physical exercise. I hope I don't sound like a Luddite when I say that, but I think we also need to use the tools that are available, and if they work, that's great. But again, I feel like because so much of how we are taught to operate in a society is so externalized, like solutions out there, the problems out there, the solutions out there, and we're constantly looking for what's going to fix us, whether it's medication, whatever it is, when often, and this is a huge cliche, but often the answer is here. The answer is some hard work on deprogramming ourselves from constantly looking at our phone, deprogramming ourselves from staying up late watching whatever, and really coming back to this connection with mind, body, spirit.
I don't know if there's been any research done on this. Maybe there probably has, but how much of a correlation is there between burnout and digital overload, like hyperstimulation?
Yeah, it's, that's a really great question, and I'm actually flagging that for our next year's studies to sort of get a metric on that, is in terms of how many hours people are spending on their phones. And it's certainly, there's a large amount of research being done into the correlation between digital overload and loneliness, isolation, digital overload and stress of itself. And I feel very confident in saying that too much, spending a lot of time on screens is absolutely a contributing factor to burnout. Because if we think about it in simple terms, so burnout is caused by chronic stress. The amount of information to which we are exposed in our daily lives, even compared to when I grew up in the 1980s in country Australia, where we would have a newspaper every day and then the nightly news. That was pretty much the day-to-day information to which I was exposed. And if we wanted to find out a fact, Alexia, this is how old I am, we would look it up in the encyclopedia.
And Same. Yeah.
Right. So it was this very low level, almost you chose to take information in. Cut to 30 years, 35 years later, and we are assaulted by information at all from all standpoints. So one of the things that when I work with people who are certainly in recovery from burnout, it's about being really mindful. I call it the nourish aspect of burnout recovery. Nourish means being very mindful about what you consume, and that's what you eat and drink, but it's very much also what information you consume. And it's a challenge because it's quite countercultural. It's almost a radical thing to do, to not be constantly absorbing information. I think there's also a lot of research starting to come out around the impact of that level of information, the type of information, the kind of comparisons to which it gives rise, the impact of that on us as a species. And it's designed to do that. It's designed to be addictive. It's designed to hook us in, and it works. And so it does really take some fierce, courageous actions, I think, on our part to kind of rebel against it.
I also grew up in the 90s, so I definitely can relate to what you're talking about. Of assignments used to be different, like not everything was the click of a finger away. You had to go to the library, find the page, make photocopies, come back home, highlight, cut. Like, it was a different world completely. And I used to be a language teacher, and I'm actually quite curious to see. I would be curious to see if burnout, I have a sneaky suspicion that burnout might be affecting students, and not even just in the workplace, but probably in schools as well, because of the amount of pressure. The pace of things is very different to when we were at school, and the expectations and the overload of information. And I think burnout is extending a lot more into the younger age groups than what we might even be imagining. I don't know what your take is on this.
I couldn't agree more, Alexia. Firstly, in our last year's report, we found that the highest rate, the numbers were quite low, so we were curious to see what this year's report shows. But our latest report shows the highest rate of burnout was amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. So we're talking people very early in their career, perhaps people who are even still university students. And while the World Health Organization defines burnout as an occupational phenomenon, therefore it takes place in the context of work, it's not limited to this sort of traditional organizational office environment that we might think of. It includes freelancers, it includes digital nomads, and it certainly includes students. And I have a colleague in Belgium who works specifically with academics and PhD candidates who some people will go through 2 burnouts before they get their doctorate. So it's certainly pervasive, and I fully agree. It's something that, this is where burnout also kind of cusps on, because it's chronic stress related. Sometimes it's difficult to sort of say categorically all of these people are burnt out, because it also has it's different to depression, for example, but there are some overlaps. There's some gray area there. I think, generally the simple fact of the information to which people are exposed and the enormous pressure that students are under, both at, at almost every level of school these days, and certainly in the university and college environment too, that taking the steps towards preventing burnout and really empowering ourselves, protecting your spark, becomes all the more important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so my next question is, give me one moment. Okay, so can you discuss the relationship between flexible work arrangements and employee well-being in remote settings? So you've touched on this a little bit, but in the last few months, we've seen big companies such as Amazon, Salesforce, and JP Morgan Chase ask for workers to return to the office. Many workers are resisting this change. Please share your views on this and how you see a balance being struck.
Another favorite topic of mine right now. I do a lot of sort of research and writing around the hybrid work environment and how this is challenging for leaders to navigate. I understand the temptation to just say, everyone back to the office, that's it. But I think that will do some fairly potentially catastrophic damage to the sense of engagement, trust, and respect for a lot of employees who have had this experience of really being able to have much more control over what their workday looks like. I think what we're seeing smart leaders do now is to really co-create solutions around this with their teams. So really involving teams in decisions around this and ensuring that people feel a sense of autonomy in their work. And this might seem like a bit of a granular distinction to make, but it's one that's important to me. We think of flexibility by definition as being a positive, but I think sometimes if we're flexible without boundaries, we will end up working all the time. So we also need to be careful that when there's flexibility, there's also really clear policies around what disconnection looks like when it happens, when and how we contact each other. Do we need to be in meetings? There's all kinds of ways we can really sort of build a healthier work culture in that way. And I think so helping people build a sense of autonomy around the choices they make about how and where they work, rather than simply giving 100% unmitigated flexibility for people to decide, I think is a wiser approach. I hope that distinction makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It did. Okay, so how do you envision, I think you've touched on this a bit, but how do you envision the sustainability of remote work in terms of employee burnout and well-being in the long run?
Sustainability is such a key word in so many ways for how we work right now. And I think particularly in the, contextualized in our career, how do we build a sustainable career? And it's really, I think, about ensuring individuals are empowered to make good choices for themselves. And that means like all of us, everyone who's listening to this right now, you have some agency to make good decisions for yourself, to build, for example, on your self-love, your self-trust, your self-knowledge. Knowing who you are and what you value is a really important way of driving healthy decision-making in your career and beyond. It's going to be these nuanced conversations, I think, between organizations and their people, these co-created solutions, and also looking at how we can really harness technology to help us. There's so much fear-mongering and there's so much kind of, I think, catastrophization in a lot of the talk about AI and other technology. But I think there's also ways that we can really use it in a positive way. And I'm seeing, and I do some work with an organization that helps companies move to reduced working times. So whether it's a 4-day week or a 9-day fortnight, whatever it might be, they often use, very deliberate design to make sure that all the things that are kind of annoying in your day-to-day job are, to the extent that they can be, they're automated, so that as much space as possible is freed up for you to be doing deeper work. And I think to that end, if there is a capacity in remote work also to have more access to nature, more access to your hobbies, this is also a really important part of burnout prevention, because burnout does tend to happen, not always, but it does tend to happen when there's long hours, no boundaries, where work starts to really consume your life at the cost and expense of the other, sources of your identity, whether that's your family and friends, your hobbies, your spirituality. So really, time is really important, I think, in that equation too.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, so I think we'd love to tap in a little bit more on the research that you do. So can you tell us a little bit about what gaps in the research around remote work and burnout in particular do you believe need more attention and exploration?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a bottomless quantity, like say, in terms of what we can research and how we can better understand things. I think really getting a deeper understanding of what it really means to people to work remotely. What are the key reasons that they're doing so, and what they get out of it, to really understand, help organizations understand, well, that must be really important for people. How can we zoom in on that and make sure that that's a part of how everyone works here? So having a bit of a deeper understanding there. And I think sort of us continuing our research as we are this year into the correlation between remote work and burnout, and just see year on year how that's tracking. I think also it's not so much around burnout and remote work, but I think just having more conversations really, and this is not even a research piece, but more conversations around mental health and remote work, making it, just creating more set space for vulnerability and for connection in remote work as well.
Mhm. Can you share any ongoing or upcoming research projects related to burnout and well-being in remote work settings, or just in general? Tell us a
Yeah,
bit more
so
about what your business.
yeah, sure. So this is actually not me, but I interviewed on my podcast, We Are Human Leaders, which I co-host with Alexa Sana. We spoke to Charlie Sull of MIT recently, and he and Donald Sull, his father, actually did some incredible research last year around toxic work culture and the toxic five, as they call them, which are the attributes which most strongly correlate with toxic work environments. They had 1.3 million data points of employee feedback from Glassdoor, and their research is phenomenal, and it's really stuck in my mind. They are on the cusp of releasing some research around toxic culture in remote work environments. So that's certainly something to look out for. I understand it'll be coming out somewhere in the next few months. And for me, as I mentioned, we've just launched the survey component of the Global Workplace Burnout Study. So we're looking at a few different sort of focus areas. One is we're really curious to see the age demographic question, because it was quite a shock to see that the youngest age demographic was the most prevalent, had the highest rate of burnout last year. We're very curious to see where that's tracking this year. We're also looking at the correlation between loneliness and isolation and burnout, which I think also has some relation to remote work. And we'll obviously then also be able to draw that sort of 3-point parallel burnout, remote work, and loneliness, and see how that sort of tracks in those three areas. And we're also looking at work time reduction, and whether working fewer hours at full pay, so companies that have made that conscious shift to a 4-day week or other modalities, whether that has an impact on burnout as well. And it's interesting that those kind of companies, those leaders who are having the foresight to make those kind of shifts, are often also the leaders who are having conversations with individuals and allowing, remote work, whether it be from a different city or even a different country. They're quite open to those kind of conversations as well. So there's some really interesting research. I'm so excited to see the results out of that, and hopefully maybe be able to share some of that with you sometime next year.
Oh, I'd love that. I'd love to have you back around February and to really deep dive into the findings, because I find this topic so fascinating.
Let's do it.
Sally, can you tell us a little bit more about Human Leader? So tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, sure. So Human Leaders is an organization. I'm a co-director, and it was founded by Alexa Sana, my co-director. And it's really a space where people-centered leaders come together to learn and to really shift the dialogue around how we lead. We're really seeing that there is an opportunity at the moment to change the narrative. We spoke to the kind of archaic ways of leading that we've seen in the past. And at Human Leaders, we really see that there are so many people who want things to be different. So we're building a community of human leaders, and we also do consultancy with teams and organizations who want to sort of embed human leadership and the human leadership framework in how they lead. And also do some culture co-creation. So we help companies actually form and sustain a healthy working culture from early on. So I'm very passionate about that work too.
Amazing. Sally, how can people get in touch with you? How can people reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. We are humanleaders.com, and my own website is salcla.com, and reach out.
Amazing. Sally, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. I feel like I could talk about this for hours on end, but it has been very, very insightful. And I'm really looking forward to having you back when your research has been wrapped up and we can really start deep diving into the findings and seeing what lessons and learnings might be available to us. So thank you so much for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure, Alexia. It was great to be here with you and with the Her Expat Life community.
Amazing. Thank you. For those of you at home, please just a reminder to visit herexpatlife.com to see our comprehensive list of offerings that we have for you. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification button, and also please comment. Leave us comments. Do you enjoy what we're doing? Do you have any questions you'd like us to deep dive into? Share your opinions and thoughts. And also, we are launching an app really, really soon. Can't say too much about it at the moment, but keep your eyes peeled to our social media platforms where all the launch information will be posted. And thank you again, Sally. We hope to have you back soon.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's been super fun.